Hey, everybody. Thanks again for joining us for this panel. And so we're talking about playtesting. So, how to play test your games. And that question, you probably have a lot of questions, but the answer to that question has changed a lot now that we're doing a lot of things digitally as well as in person. So, as much as we can. So, we're excited about talking to you about playtesting. I will introduce myself first, and then we'll let everybody else introduce themselves. I'm Omari Akil. I'm game designer and co-owner, co-founder of a publishing company, Board Game Brothers. We have basically two games under our belt now. I also have a couple projects and collaborations that I've done outside of our publishing company. But yeah, hoping to share a little bit about my process with you all today. And Bruce, you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Bruce Harlick. I am also a game designer. I got my start a long time ago working on Champions in the Hero system. I ran that line for a lot of years, did a bunch of freelancing, and then jumped over to the video game space. These days, I'm lead systems designer at Hangar 13 Games here in Nevada, California. And that kind of brings a little different perspective, I think, on playtesting, which will be interesting. We'll find out. Hey, Jessie, over to you.
I'm Jessie Edwards. Hello. I'm a game designer from Canada. I have been designing games pretty much my whole life, just as like a noob in my basement. And then in 2017, I got the METATOPIA sponsorship, which opened up the world of gaming to me. So the last couple years, I've been, honing down on my skills and networking and really developing who I am as a designer and where I want to go with that. So a lot of time play testing and kind of like wandering the industry. So this is like directly what I'm doing now.
Awesome. And I'm Daryl Andrews. I'm a freelance game designer. My most known game is a game I co-designed called Sagrada with Adrian Adamescu, and I usually work with a few different game designers. I love co-design and try to work with different publishers. I also have a little tiny new company called Evergreen Game Studios where we help develop and come alongside other board game publishers and help support them and do that on the side. So yeah, this is I love board games. I love making games, and playtesting is my life. So looking forward to the discussion.
Nice. Does anybody want to kind of just start off with any of their sort of automatic, like go-to playtesting sort of philosophies or tips that really just that you feel like are the most meaningful to you?
Um, so playtesting is not the same as playing a game, and I think sometimes that gets lost when in the midst of the playtest. For board games, it's not about winning or losing, or even sometimes about having a good time. It's about, but although I think you should try to have a good time in a playtest, it's about testing specific systems or specific story flows in a role playing game or whatnot. I'll open with a story. Years ago, we were at a Gamma trade show, and it was when White Wolf just had come out with Wraith. And I'd been playing a lot of Mage at that point, and being an old Champions guy, we were having some problems with White Wolf's combat system and firearms. And so I wandered over to ask Danny Block about how they dealt with it when they ran into it and played their playtests with the fact that firearms seemed to be less effective the better you got with them and all. And Danny looked at me deadpan and said, well, we're all such good role players that we tend to role play ourselves out of combat situations when we get into them. And he left it at that. That obviously is not effective playtesting.
That's awesome.
Leave some things to be desired, I think.
I think he was pulling my chain, but
well, I mean, I would like to echo kind of what Bruce is saying here, though, that it's really important to understand that playtesting is kind of a unique experience. And so when it comes to even finding playtesters, it's important to really kind of clarify and also understand that this is a new skill that people are going to be developing. So like the biggest thing that I really think like fundamentally is that as designers, we need to respect playtesters and respect that there's a process that we're going to now need to invest in our playtesters and help also direct how a playtest should go. Because right away there's this expectation of, well, we're just sitting down and playing a game, and now there's new criteria, there's new kind of process that from the designer's perspective we have certain wants and wishes that are going to happen, and so we need to set the stage. We need to be able to communicate and set really appropriate expectations, and that might mean saying certain things at the start, really encouraging people, for instance, to be brutally honest when maybe in our social contracts in life we ask people maybe not to be as brutally honest as we need during a playtest. Or it could be anything from like making sure that we listen to one another, because there can be sometimes environments where people might talk over each other or may think because of strategy you shouldn't talk about certain things. There's all these kind of unspoken expectations, and so you need to bring those out right from the start. I think it's really important, and I'm sure we can talk a little bit about what kind of things do we do to help set the stage and make sure that respect is like the highest criteria of a playtest session.
Yeah, I mean, I could give some examples, but before we give some examples of expectations, I also kind of I couple it with expectations because it feels like an expectation on myself, but like having really specific goals when you go into a playtest, because that frames how you're looking at things too, and also that's going to change potentially the expectations that you have of the players. So yeah, in some combination of those things is really what makes, for me, an effective playtest is good goals, and then making sure your players understand how your goals relate to how they're playtesting, and you set those expectations accordingly.
I think that especially for new designers, they don't understand the importance of investing that time in playtesting. They're like, oh, my family loved this game. It's a fantastic game. It's a great game. It's so amazing. My sister told me. And it's like the people near you the most, they're not truly honest, and they're a little bit biased. And of course, they're going to love your game. And it's so important to play test the hell out of your game. You need different views, different, like unique, like the more diverse your playtesters, the more the quality of your feedback will be so much more valuable. And like when I went to Metatopia for the first time, like all my playtesters were family and friends, were like people who were very close to me. And the feedback I got from like industry professionals and other designers, even if you have nothing published, the feedback they were giving was so like, you can't put a price tag on that at all. And my games became so much more, they were better. They were so much more than they were. And it's investment, it's time investment, and you have to like people give of their time, right? So be super thankful to your playtesters. That's like number one. And it's community building as well for your game. So it's all good.
Yeah, I think,
oh, go ahead, Bruce.
I was going to say, I think, Jesse, you're right with that community building. Your playtesters will become your ambassadors, the people who are going to, keep an eye out for this game. Look for this when it gets published because it was awesome, or it's got some great ideas, or that type of thing. We do a lot of what we call usability testing on video games, where we bring people in to sit them down blind in front of our computer and to play the game. And one thing we really encourage, and tech companies do this as well with their usability testing, is to have the play testers talk through what they're doing. You really want your play testers to be vocalizing what they're thinking as they're playing the game, what they're doing, what their thought process is. I don't know about y'all, but I find it very, very helpful, because a lot of times they may look like they're doing great, but they'll be saying, I'm not really sure what this is doing, but it seems to be effective, so I'm going to keep doing it. Or should I be going over there? I don't know. Just encourage them to talk.
Yeah, well, and similarly, while kind of encouraging people to talk, I think also there's a lot of observation skills beyond even the verbal that I think are crucial for the game designer. So I think one of the things that I would really encourage, and it's a plug also, is I love the fail faster journals, but in general, you need to write down as much as you can throughout the session, and that's going to even give you some direction. As Omari mentioned, like goals, like write down your goals, start putting down notes like that are directly related to your goals, and then even just things like observations like this person's disengaged, or these people, their body language. Like write down what you're seeing and how people are playing and when that's happening, and then later on when you revisit your notes, you'll be able to specifically focus on the problems of your games instead of just maybe like the end discussion, which often kind of gets over prioritized. I think it's really important to use the entire playtime to use that for strategic observation.
Yeah, and I was gonna note taking is so incredibly important. Something I give myself a hard time about not writing down enough, because it's a lot to capture. And I have and some people, and I think it's possible now a little bit. It's a little bit easier in digital playtesting. Some people do record playtesting sessions that they can go back and look at and review their notes and kind of be able to kind of see almost exactly what things are happening. Obviously, this is something you need permission of all of your playtesters before you do. But in terms of just being able to capture what's happening and go back and review and understand, definitely take as many notes as possible. But every once in a while, I think it's appropriate to capture like a full play test and really check that out and see all the moving parts of what's happening, and really kind of dig into some things that you don't necessarily notice when you're doing it on the fly and just writing down notes.
Yeah, to pick up on something that Daryl said about working with other designers, working with a collaborator and note taking, I find it often helps to have somebody who's concentrating on moderating the game and there to facilitate the playtest and answer any questions that come up, and somebody who's taking notes. Trying to do both, you quite often split your attention. You have to do that sometimes when you're the sole designer developer on something. But if you can, if you're working with somebody, you can find someone who can moderate, someone who knows your game well, maybe who's playtested a lot, who can moderate for you while you're observing and taking notes. That could be very, very helpful. I'm taking notes as we're going along, so I don't forget.
I find that from experience, from the first times I was playtesting, people give a lot, like you were saying, during your game, they say a lot, and not even directly to you, but their reactions and the things they do. And I find at the end of playtesting, people tend to kind of go off a little bit. Like they'll hit an idea about your game, and like you could turn it into this and turn it into that theme. I find what happens at the end of your game is less valuable as feedback as watching them what they do and say during your game. So not that at the end it's not valuable, it's just I find people tend to go off on tangents about random things and random ideas, and it's not necessarily really, valuable to your game design or to what you have shown them, like what's on the table. So I pay way more attention to what's happening during and the little comments they say between them or their reactions, because that's where your real value is, and how they're interacting with your game directly.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of, actually. I might even go farther than you, Jesse, and say like the end discussion is almost useless. I appreciate, and the reason I do it actually is more just out of respect. Like I just want to give people time to show that I'll listen, because they just listened and participated in a game that I asked them to do. But really, the most valuable information I feel like I've already captured. Now, there might be some stuff that comes out in that discussion. And also, I differentiate and say, especially designers, they have a lot to say at the end because they hold back versus like naturally like a variety of other playtesters might really reveal themselves during it. And I think there's a really big distinction of that. I know early on when I started playtesting games, I discovered I got to playtest with a bunch of designers early on, and I didn't realize this was unique, but I thought, hey, cool, that's really fun. And they gave really great advice at the end. But unfortunately, I listened too much. And so I think there's also a lesson of discernment and learning, what starting, going back to what Omari said about having goals. You're making your game. And so you're trying to discern how to make that best experience. But make sure you also don't end up making someone else's game. So that feedback is important, but you need to interpret it. You need to discern it, and then find out what ways to make the vision you're making better.
Not all advice is good advice. You can't please everybody, and you have to stay true to yourself and your game.
Exactly. And even when you're working with a larger team, you need to know what you really believe in and where you're willing to be guided by advice or feedback, as well. As we like to say, because I work with very large teams these days, of 80, 100, 200 people or whatever. You get a lot of feedback. You have a lot of bosses, and you just need to know what hills you're going to die on, defending those things that you really, really feel are good for your game.
I'm curious. I mean, there's a few basic things that I think of always when it comes to recording notes, but we mentioned note taking. I'm curious if we could maybe share a few things that we try to write down or have intentions to write down. Not that we always do, but I know, like, for instance, like one thing I always say, and my playtesters think it's hilarious, is like, oh shoot, what time did we start this? And like what other things are we trying to write down that hopefully we can get in the habit, and maybe even encourage other people. What are some good habits to write down?
I laugh specifically because I always forget to record the time, and I'm usually so far in development before I'm ever like, wait, how long does this game actually take? And I know that, yeah, that's one of my big ones that I miss. One that I'm always very intentional about, is when I see players struggling to make decisions, and you can usually kind of pick that out. I like to just record those scenarios because sometimes, yeah, I can find issues with balance. I can find issues with just having good potential next steps in a mechanic or in a system where people, yeah, if anybody just takes a really long time to make decisions. Obviously sometimes there's analysis paralysis, but I'm hyper aware of that because things that slow my games down are issues to me if they're not intentional, if they're not really meaningful to players. So I'm always aware of, yeah, looking for, okay, this is taking a really long time. I wonder why. Sometimes I'll interject and ask a question at that moment, but I definitely want to know, okay, what's the situation that potentially caused this?
I'd like to record the actions the players have taken, especially if it's, let's say, a board game design where there are a discrete number of actions a player could choose per turn or whatever. It really helps determine, oh, no one's really using this fifth action here. Maybe it's not necessary. Maybe it needs to be better. Maybe the other ones are too good.
Yeah, kind of similarly also on the note-taking side, and we keep coming back to the same things, but I think one thing too is recording what rules or what focus your test is on, and then kind of continuing to see the observations if that's improving or making it worse. I'm kind of I try often to really focus on only a few iterations at a time, and so I think it's really important to see, like, during your test, if you're writing down like, oh, this part, I've changed the beginning of the game, you then might not even finish the playtesting of the game. So I think it's really important to really record and focus your goals on your test. And I think for example, I heard the story of Uwe Rosenberg. He only plays something like 20-minute segments of his game, and he playtests it over and over and over until that has become strong, and then he moves on to the next 20-minute segment of the experience. So he might just work on kind of the buildup of your game or the middle of your game. The other thing that kind of along the same lines is I'll often try to start the game at the middle point and ultimately see how much of the front I can cut off, because I ultimately like to get people started in the game sooner in the action, and I find sometimes that a slow grow or a slow burn at the beginning of the game can be problematic. So instead of worrying too much about that, just start your game in the middle and test from there, and then see how much of that you can kind of start people off. I'm curious what other people do when it comes to like kind of running your sessions and respecting time.
I think another option, just for along the same lines of what you're describing, of like getting to the action or specifically, getting to the part of the game you want to test. Don't be afraid to stack the deck. Like if it's a card game and you're looking for trying to figure out how a specific set of actions are going to interact with each other, organize the deck so that those cards are going to come out in the order you need them to, so you can see what you want to test. I think that's totally valid too. I mean, it would be similar, like Daryl's talking about. If you're trying to start in the middle of the game, you would have to do some setup to create that experience. This is another way to do it. You can just do it at the beginning of the game too, and it just depends exactly what your goal is and what you're trying to test. But I wouldn't be afraid of doing that kind of setup either.
Yeah, and for role-playing games, it works the same way. If there's systems or flows you want to test, just start where they're going to be appropriate. You don't need to run the ramp up to them. You don't need to necessarily run the aftermath of them. If you want to test combat, test combat. Set up a combat situation, dump people through there. If you want to test a mystery portion of your game, just start with the players in that mystery portion without all the warm up.
Well, one part I already warned the other guests on this panel that I'm the curmudgeon on this topic, but I'm assuming we need to get into this, so I'll break the ice, even though I'm a hater. Is digital testing and how people are getting playtesting done now, especially in light of COVID and trying to find safe ways to be able to progress playtesting. So I'll open the floor. What are people finding are positives, and I might have a few negatives of doing some digital tabletop playtesting using things like Tabletop Simulator or Tabletopia, or what other sources are people using to be able to continue playtesting in times like now?
I'm so old school. Like when it comes to all of the fancy internet sites, I can't do it. So I'm finding for me, it's easier to just send like a print and play version and just go live. So have the groups play, and then I can just watch. Like there's a lot of bubbles, families, and just get the game out there, or even like designers and publishers, because like I don't know how to use the websites, and it's a whole new learning curve. Like just being a designer and designing and playtesting, like you basically have to become a jack of all trades now, because you have to be technologically savvy and you have to like still do all the other stuff. And no, so I'll send you a print to play, we'll video and chat, and I can have it set up on my table too, and we can talk things out. But it's a struggle. The struggle is real to get like valuable play tests in, and they're so important and needed that you got to get creative.
Yeah, it's really hard. Using Tabletop Simulator, you lose the body language. A lot of times you lose the facial expressions, and the comments that get muttered under the breath, or that aren't necessarily meant for your ears, but that are very instructive. Earlier this year, I participated in judging some educational board games, and we all got set print and plays, and the four of us judges all set them up and tried to play through them via Zoom, and even that was hard. And I've got respect, Jessie, for you being able to do that and get good feedback. It's great if your testers are all in one place, and then I think you could get the feedback. But if you're dealing with folks who are distributed in different places, it's hard to get that gestalt, that whole, from the experience.
Yeah,
Ooh,
I was
I
just
mean,
gonna
it's
mention Jesse. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Omar.
well, I mean, I'm kind of leaning in the same direction. Like it's hard. I'm doing it where I have to do it. But it is challenging. There's so many things. I mean, Bruce hit a bunch of them. There's so many things that you can't determine. And I mean, back to our previous comment, the time it takes to play a game. I've run, probably 40, 50 playtests of something digitally, and I still have no idea how long it's going to take if you're playing in real life. So just knowing that there's all these limitations is really like if there's certainly things that you can test effectively in a digital environment, but you have to be very careful about choosing what those things are and what you actually can accomplish because it is so different and there are so many limitations.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Jesse, the process you just described that you're using is very similar to Matt Leacock, and I remember sitting in a panel where he described his process, and he's quite actually quite mastered this idea of having like print and play and everything packaged and ready. And what he has is he has groups even blind play test and videotape themselves as they take it out of the box, as they learn the rules, they talk out loud, they play test the game, then they send the video back, and he watches all this video footage, which I'm mad respect and impressed by. I don't know if I have the due diligence because he does this wide. He has a bunch of groups do this and then watches video after video, and it says he even kind of has learned to master it watching them a little bit in like 1.5 time or something like to be able to speed through all this information and such. But I think that's like that the extreme example of what you're describing, Jesse, and I think that's a really great alternative solution. I know for myself, I've really wrestled and struggled with, the problems that everyone has mentioned. But I really also think it's important to understand that probably digital testing is only going to serve certain purposes. So, for instance, like using a Tabletopia or something like that is going to be really effective in the fine tuning and in the kind of like mass play testing, probably on the kind of last stages. But it's really hard to be intuitive and to understand feelings through that medium when things are so raw and when things are so early in design. I know for myself, for example, I always prototype with card sleeves, and I'm constantly pulling cards out, writing on them, scratching things out, changing things on the fly. And yes, that's possible digitally, but that is not, like, for example, very conducive to my process. So I'm curious, what other things are you finding that you're doing differently or figuring out how to play test in times like now?
Oh, I mean, for me, I've had to at least at some level resort to a lot of playtesting where I am kind of role playing multiple types of players going playing against each other in a game. That is kind of a necessary thing that I do now that I really hadn't even thought about doing before. Probably once or twice when I was really struggling with something. But now it's been a part of my process, I think, to actually, yeah, play double two, two players. I've actually played a game where I was four different players and I was trying to play four different sort of player styles
Yeah,
to see how things worked out.
yeah. I
And
was curious
it's
when you
it's
say
tough.
styles. When you say styles, because my friend Jesse Wright has just talked about how he started making cards for like certain almost personalities at the table while
Yeah,
he
that's
plays by
exactly
himself.
what
Can you
I'm
talk
talking
through
about.
like yeah, what do you do with that?
Yeah, I mean, so the game that I was designing was luckily fairly small. It was like a 80 card game. So there's not so many interactions that it wasn't possible to do. But I did. I created a few different personalities, and they're not even complex. There was a player who was just a little more aggressive, a little more risk taking. There's a player that's obviously a little more conservative. I had one player that was hyper focused on their secret goal, so no matter what, they would always kind of play towards that. And I can't remember the other one, but yeah, just creating those sort of personalities, really it makes it easy on you while you're doing it. Because you know, okay, it's this person's turn, these are what their options are, this is what that personality would do. I'm going to play it that way. And then you can kind of see how things resolve towards the end, or each round, kind of you get a little picture of what the game looks like, potentially from different perspectives that you made up and you're kind of doing on your own.
That's interesting because that's also totally a video game development technique. A lot of the publishers will invest a lot of money figuring out player personas and their market segmentation and kind of correlating those two. And when you're figuring out a feature set for a game and testing features, you're looking at your target personas and what is this feature, what percentage of our market is this feature going to make happy or serve? And an interesting technique to bring it into the tabletop like that, because different people, they fall into buckets or they straddle them, but they definitely could get segmented like that. And it must be very, very helpful to be able to get into that mindset.
Oh, I remember my fourth player. It was a disengaged player, and I basically just randomly picked a card to play for them. Because that is a thing that I have seen in real gameplay scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
I'm imagining you changing seats and putting on the hat and putting on the scarf.
I don't have enough tables or chairs in my workspace for that. But I could tell you what, it was complicated. I was getting lost a little bit, constantly just having all these different cards, and I'm like, okay, whose turn is it? Which deck? What's hand is theirs? So yeah, that has its issues too, for sure.
That's awesome. That's so good. I another thing that I'm curious about, and we mentioned the observation and whatnot, but also I do think that the kind of the end of a session time, especially if you're directing and kind of like you have goals in mind. I'm curious if in your toolbox of like doing playtesting over the years now, you have some go-to questions or go-to ways to encourage kind of constructive conversation at the end or even during. And I'll lead us off with one that I've stolen completely from Senfong Lim. He mentored me, and I hold no bars that a lot of my best stuff is just stuff that I stole from him. But my favorite one that I've completely stolen from him is he asked the question, what would make this game 5% better? And I just love that as an example of a question that gives permission and really empowers a player to be able to be critical, but not feel like the weight of solving all the problems is on their shoulders. But I think it's a really kind of deceptive and really a powerful kind of question. And I'm curious, what other questions have you found or ways have you found to encourage constructive feedback at the end?
I think I have one sort of like sneaky question, kind of along the same lines of what you're describing, and that's
sneaky.
like, yeah, and it's what part of the game would you be upset if it was removed? And they have to think about that in a slightly different way. It's like they have to care about it enough and sort of know that it would make the experience worse for them. But people's answer to that question is going to highlight the parts of your game that really connect with them. And so those are things that I pay more attention to in terms of, keeping them intact as much as possible, or at least just paying more attention to, what does that thing offer the game now? Let me actually take a critical look at that.
Yeah, I do like to cue them up with the classic designer interview question about generally you'd ask someone about their favorite game, and then what was your favorite thing about the game? What was your least favorite thing about the game, and why? Pretty apparent and obvious questions, but if you let them start with what they liked about it, the best, quite often, then when you ask them the reverse of that, they'll be honest with you.
I really like just the question. Just my mind went blank. Would you replay this? And I'm hoping for a no, because I feel like exactly we're selling replayability, right? Like you buy a game not to play it once. And when they're like, no, I'm like, great. Why? Like, I want to know why. What is it about this? Because that's what you have to fix, right? Like, that's the whole purpose of my game is I want you to play this every Monday night with your family and friends. Why would you not play it? And I find that insight can really, if they're like, yeah, I'd replay it. Yeah, okay, but like, why? But I feel like when they say no, you get like, that's what I like. And I hope they say no, and I hope they tell me why.
Yeah, one question that I asked that's kind of similar and really gets people to think, like, willing to be kind of harsh to me is I'll say, so how much would you pay for this? And that very quickly like forces someone to be like, well, I mean, I don't know if I'd buy this, or
Yeah.
I'd maybe only pay like $5 for this, or like things like that. And then those comments really force like, okay, well, like, how can we get there? So it's a similar question of just trying to get people to be kind of brutally honest and show that there's some permission there. And also, I think a question like that also helps evaluate a game on a different access point, because I think sometimes we designers might get too focused on the mechanics and the story, and we don't necessarily think of it as a product. So I think also it's important somewhere in the testing process, probably more on the back end, also start thinking about the game as a product and how people are willing to kind of spend money for it, because that's at the end of the day, unless you're offering free print and plays, that's going to be a practical reality that's going to come up.
Yeah, I always ask that, Daryl, too, at the end of playtest. Whenever the game gets to the point where like I've already introduced art elements, and yeah, I have it is closer to what the final version will look like. I always ask that.
Any horror stories before we? I think we're going to have questions soon, but does anyone have any playtester horror stories, either that they firsthand experienced or even witnessed? Maybe at the table next year or something like that.
I am like a walking disaster. And like, I swear I use spell check. And I don't know why, but there's something in the universe just doesn't want me to get it right. And to the point where I entered some sell sheets in the all but published thing. And one of the reviewers is like, it's really hard to sell a game that's 4 to 6 players. And I'm like, none of my games are 4 to 6 players? What? And
Whoops.
I wrote on the sell sheet, instead of 2 to 6, I don't know how or why. I went through it a million times. And I was like, why? Why do I do these things myself? I always have typos. And like in my rules, there was one time where I kind of hosted pre-COVID, like a big play testing event. And I invited like lots of people via social media. And the wrong rules got printed, and the players were doing something really bizarre. And I was like, why are all your meeples in a pile over here? And they're like, that's what the rules said. And I'm like, that's the most unlogical. None of you question. Like, I was like, what? An editor made a mistake somewhere, misunderstood something, and rewrote something, and it messed it all up. And I trusted them and didn't go through my own rules. So there was, the whole day was a wash because they weren't even playtesting the right current rules. So I rented a hall, had 40-ish players playing a game, and I was like, well, gosh darn it, yeah.
Ouch.
So go over your rules over one last time before you're on your way to playtests. Check your spelling. Don't trust Google Docs. Don't trust Photoshop. Like, really have someone go through it, because it can cost you opportunities. It really can.
I would say also go over your components as well, because the typos that get into the rules could get onto your cards, could get onto your boards, and just really make your results not useful to you.
My only sort of like playtesting disaster didn't have much to do with the playtesting, but it was just at the very, very tail end of a 4-day convention. And I think we were all so exhausted, like nobody could focus. And I was saying things wrong and they were doing things wrong. And the feedback was like we were all exhausted. And I just felt it. I was like, I honestly don't know if I could use anything from this entire playtest. I think I was definitely not taking enough notes. Like it was just really hard. So I do now more aware of my own energy going into a playtest and like know that okay, I need to be able to do this effectively. That requires some effort on my part, and I need to have the energy to do that.
Yeah, one story I'll share that I laugh about now, but it's also like an important caution is that especially early designers, it's easy to get defensive or it's easy to passionately defend, the things that you're working on instead of realizing that really a person's only saying things for your advantage, for your opportunity to get better. But I'm a fairly argumentative person, and early on while designing, I remember I was running a playtest, and a designer started getting very angry. He was playtesting, and he got vocal and started kind of basically yelling at me that the game was too complicated and no way could a kid play this and da 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 because the theme was fairly light and very family friendly, and it got heated to a point that like people around the room were like getting awkward, like uncomfortable. I was watching people like kind of like leave the room, and instead of just like kind of backing down, I unfortunately like engaged and met them where they were at. And the funny part about it is that in the end, we talked about it, and they were so passionate about it that they ended up becoming my co-designer for the game. And that passion actually worked great, but it doesn't usually work out that way. And so, thankfully, both of us understood and respected each other, even though it was kind of argumentative and pretty vocal. But I think in general, I think it's important for people to remember, like, to de-escalate and to also like really try to listen to your playtester and not be defensive. I think that's a really easy thing to bleed in because it's your baby and it's the thing that you poured your time into and you think it should make sense or it should work. And instead it just, take that in, glean that in, write it down. Even if you disagree, give a little bit of time for someone to be able to vocalize and be able to express their opinion, because at least the time is worth it. So, and on that note of time, we can probably jump into questions before we run out of time.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm
you hit some
here,
good things.
and I do have some questions queued up. Audience, this would also be a great time for you to ask some more. Put them in the chat, and I'll add them to the list. But here I go with the very first question that we had asked. Earlier, you were talking about comments at the end after the actual test itself was over, and mentioned that sometimes they're not always that useful. And Arch Create wants to know if comments at the end are not useful, should you use surveys or other things that players can write down as feedback forms or something like that?
That's a great question. I'll jump in real quick with one thing. I'm sure everyone's got some feedback on that, but one thing that I'd really stress or encourage is I often say to players, I don't need to hear your feedback right away or right now. Like sometimes your best ideas are going to come to you on the drive home or the next day. So I even encourage, and I think fits into this idea of a survey as well, is if you have some type of structure where people could Google form it or do something like that, be able to give you feedback even later, or be able to kind of write down their stuff. I think that's a really constructive tool and can be really helpful.
Yeah, I'll second.
I have used like Google Forms too. Google Forms, and I've used surveys. I think they're all very situational, but I feel like they've all been very useful in different contexts. So definitely good ideas.
I've also used immediate post-game surveys, printed out, and had people fill them out right there before we get to the kind of closing discussion and things and whatnot. It's sometimes important to capture. Surveys are great because people can give you your feedback without being influenced by the conversation that's going on, which can happen in those group discussions. Someone could definitely steer the attitude of folks towards the game, and maybe bias them without even intending to.
I always print out sheets going into a playtest, and I'll have different types because different people live things differently. So I'll have kind of like an open-ended one where people can just free write like pros, cons, that thing. And sometimes I'll have a questionnaire because some people like to take notes and jot things down. I'll have one that's like specific questions because not everyone can relay their experience the same way, and people can just kind of pick and choose the form. And at the bottom, there's always a link to either a Google form or somewhere where they can get a hold of me if they want to keep discussing it or send some information or whatever afterwards. So you always give your players a multiple ways, lots of ways to get a hold of you and communicate with you. The easier you make it on them, the easier it'll be on you to receive that information and then process it.
Yeah, that's really great stuff. I also think as games get more into the development process, that this idea of like surveying and such can become really quite meaningful for being able to kind of trend analysis, the fine tuning. And I know, for instance, John Gilmore was someone who taught me a lot about like using, for instance, Reddit for mass play testing. And so one of the things that he taught me when he was telling me about his process there is that like building kind of and growing the survey questions, like kind of like wave one, having a bunch of survey questions, but then as you progress through the development, like changing the survey questions that you're asking, I think ties into even what we were talking early on about goals and really kind of funneling the conversation.
Excellent. Okay, another question. This is from Cthulhu Joel, and they're asking if someone can comment on how usable Tabletop Simulator's chat function is.
Yeah, I don't think it's that useful at all, actually. It's got horrible UX. It's disruptive. Whenever we're using Tabletop Simulator, we're using probably Discord to voice chat and also Discord to text chat when we need to. My opinion.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think you nailed it.
Okay, another question. How do you get people to video themselves playtesting your game? How do you get groups to record it for you? Do you pay them?
I've never paid playtesters before. If that's a thing, I'm not aware of it. No one's ever asked me to pay them either. They usually just turn on Skype, Discord, Zoom, Messenger. There's so many ways, and they just literally turn on their camera and kind of even your phone. Like people do all their phones, and they just hold it up with a little tripod, kickstand, duct tape, and a post, whatever you've got, and they just film themselves playing. And what's great is all of these methods you can also record while you play, so you can record them and watch them play live, answer questions. It sounds complicated when it's something you've never done, but it's quite easy to set up and get going, and you get used to it fairly quickly.
I will mention like we all pay in some way because usually it's through social currency of like we play test each other's stuff and we earn some, some valuable respect and love from generous people that are willing to play test our things. But I do think it's a growing trend and something that I think will only become more prevalent is paying for playtesting and paying for development services. Most of that I would encourage is on the publisher side and not on the designer side. And so hopefully that translates to not being too expensive because already the designer makes a very small slice of the pie. And so if we're paying for that, that really makes this it's already not lucrative. So you might be like losing money per game. But what one service that I'll give a plug, just because I know he recently announced it, is John Gilmore offered to playtest people's games at a very reasonable rate, and someone like that is an expert. With like you're gaining years and years of wisdom and whatnot out of those playtests, and so to me that's almost like a developer working on your game. So I think that's a possibility, but I warn people, especially new designers, don't spend a lot of money. Save your money and maybe just play test a bunch of other people's stuff and then ask them to play test your stuff.
I know that, like, for me, there's a big publisher who was looking at one of my games and who actually took it to focus groups. So those types of things, like, they recruit people and those people are paid, but that's at like the publisher level. Like I would never pay like for focus groups to be looking at my game. So like there is people who are play testers who are paid, but that's at a much higher level than like the designer.
Yeah, focus groups are incredibly expensive. We do a lot of that in the video game world, and we're fortunately they can afford it. But they're, to get someone to get your pool of players and run it and whatnot can run you $50,000 or $100,000 to get people running through it. You don't want to do that, I think, on a tabletop game.
Okay, great. We've got about 8 minutes left. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll do a wrap up if that's okay. So the final question is from Darren Watts, and how do you build and maintain your home group of early testers before things are ready for strangers?
Feed them.
Absolutely the right answer.
Pizza and beer.
Yeah. I also
Pizza
try
and
to
beer.
like sometimes when I get like designer copies, those are the people that get them. Shout outs in the rule books. Treat them like gold, and just those are your main people that put up with the worst version of your game. So whatever way you can bribe them to not run away is worth it.
For Darren, in the early days when George was designing and playtesting Champions, and he would do it on our Wednesday night, I think it was Wednesday, play group, people who found a rules loophole, something that was broken, could play it the night that they found it and run roughshod over whatever scenario or villains or whatever we were playing, and then George would design around it. And that was an incentive to try to find very broken things in the game. And we had one player, Steve Goodman, who was fantastic at that. And he always had a new character every week, and it was broken as all get out. And he had a blast with it, and it kept him coming back.
There's actually a lot of community groups for playtesting, and even in my hometown, there's a group of designers. They meet once a week, and everybody brings one game, and you all play. You spend some time playtesting each other's game, and there are those groups. Like I'm in Canada, but I know there's some in the States. I know there's some everywhere, and they're pretty easy to find. And even like if you're brand new and you don't have any resources, even your local game store, that is like the place to go because that's where all board gamers go and designers. And some of them have bulletin boards. Like it's really easy to find. It takes some homework doing, of course, but they do exist and people are there to support you. And I have never met another community as supportive and amazing as this one. People want to help. People want to support each other. They're all there. So like the people at METATOPIA, the people, like we are your community and we will support you. You just have to ask. Don't be afraid to ask and do unto others as they do to you. Make yourself available and others will be there for you as well.
Excellent. Okay, so let's use these last 5 minutes for the four of you to just one more time say who you are, what you're up to, how you can be reached on social media, et cetera, and what cool things you're working on. And then we'll close it out.
I'm Bruce Harlick.
I can start since I started.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Omari Akil, and you can find me on Twitter. That's probably the easiest. It's just my name, Omari Akil, and on Twitter. Our company is BG Brothers. If you are looking for that, cool thing, we're working on a lot of cool things, but our biggest thing now is we have a live Kickstarter actually for our second game, Hoop Gods, which is a two-player head-to-head street basketball game that I think has some really, really cool elements to it. So yeah, that's me.
I'm
Go ahead, Jen. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I'm Jessie Edwards. On all social medias, I'm the amazing Jessie. It's like one word. Jessie Edwards Games on Facebook. I've got like 6 games that I've been working on for years, that I've really, since 2017, when I won the sponsorship to Metatopia, I've really been working on and improving and designing. And they're kind of like at the end of that whole process. So I'm starting to like reach out to publishers now. And I just like, you know what I love about a designer is like when you go back to like original designs and you look like, 3 years ago, and you're like, oh, my baby's grown. I'm having that moment now. So yeah, so lots of things in the future, good things. I'm excited.
So I'm Bruce Harlick. You can find me on Facebook under that, or on Instagram under Amazing Foxbat. On Twitter under Bruce HH. I don't really honestly tweet or post that much about games. It's mostly cocktails for me, but there it is.
That sounds awesome, Bruce. I gotta follow you now. I'm looking forward to some cocktail recipes. I've been missing the tiki bars. So, my name's Daryl Andrews. You can find me on the different social medias. Usually, my middle initial M is in there, so it looks like Daryl Mandrews. Yeah, you can find me on those. I don't do a lot on social media, but I try to follow up with people. Facebook's maybe the best way to get a hold of me. Interesting projects. Right now, I'm really excited about and really been focused on a game that I'm doing for Cryptozoic. It's a licensed product, so it's Dark Knight Returns with Frank Miller art, and pretty excited about it because it's designed around a one-player experience. I have no idea if people will support that, but I really hope so. But at times like now, we thought, why not, especially see if there's an audience for that. So I'm co-designing that with Morgan Donteville, who's the creative director at Gatan Studios, and we are both passionate about this book and really trying to capture the experience. And so it's been really fun to work with him and to work on such an important license and story that we love, and really fanboy every day working on that and getting to play test it and whatnot. And hopefully it'll be accepted and loved by others too, but it's in that like wait and see. And so we're kickstarting that in late January, so keep an eye out for that. And yeah, so that's what keeps me up at night right now is that. And there's a few other projects that I'm getting to work with, some fun publishers and the early stages, but I'm really excited to work with some new people. So yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, audience members. Thank you, panelists. This has been your disembodied voice, Mickey Bradley. And we're going to wrap this one up. If you want to go chat about this more in the Metatopia Discord, in the panel watch party channel, that would be a great thing that people can do after this if you're watching it live. And I just want to say thanks to everybody. This was a good one. We had almost 50 people for most of this panel. So great. All right. Take care, everybody. Have a great Metatopia.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mickey. Thanks, Andy.
Bye.
Bye.